Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack a truly fascinating and honestly pretty surprising medical link between societal freedom and our physical health. We usually think of politics, society, and medicine as completely separate domains, right? But today, we're looking at research that treats a lack of autonomy, basically a lack of control over our own lives and communities, not just as a political issue, but as a massive hidden driver of chronic stress and a full-blown global public health crisis.
Let's kick things off with a pretty startling statistic from the Global Burden of Disease study published in The Lancet. A massive 95% of the global population currently carries at least one health condition. Just take a second to absorb that. Nearly the entire human population is operating at a health deficit. We are a species under immense biological strain right now. And the severity of this crisis is just staggering. Nearly two-thirds of the world, a massive 66%, is living with 3 or more health conditions at the exact same time. Only 5% of the population has 0. So the big question becomes, what exactly is driving this unprecedented global burden of disease? The answer might not be a virus, but actually the structure of our modern society itself. To figure out how we treat this global epidemic of stress, our agenda today is straightforward. First, we'll look at a sick, divided world. Second, autonomy as a health strategy. Third, the Freetown Christiania experiment. Fourth, surviving the real world. And fifth, reclaiming peace and autonomy.
Section 1. A sick, divided world.
According to the health and social frameworks we're studying today, the major global source of chronic stress is what's called the divided world. And this is characterized by 4 really severe societal symptoms. First, the erosion of social cohesion, basically the fraying of our communal bonds, trust, and mutual solidarity. Second, autonomy is under siege, meaning our individual and collective self-determination is being systematically compromised. Third, we have an institutional legitimacy crisis, where world organizations and governance structures are viewed as powerless, discredited, or even oppressive. And finally, polarization vectors, deep ideological, political, and religious divides that are driven almost entirely by emotional rather than logical frameworks.
So the crucial takeaway here is this. Living in a hyper-divided, hostile sociopolitical climate creates a massive, chronic, physiological burden on us. When autonomy is suppressed and everything is hyper-politicized, alienation and powerlessness literally manifest physically in our bodies. This chronic stress can actually eclipse acute physical threats. It's driving those epidemics of chronic disease we talked about right at the start of this explainer.
Section 2. Autonomy as a health strategy.
Now that we have a diagnosis that our disrupted society is quite literally making us sick, let's explore the proposed remedy. This brings us to the Marcinus Health Capital strategy. Under this framework, autonomy is completely separated from everyday political talking points. Instead, it's defined strictly as a core biological and health necessity to survive. The strategy focuses heavily on restoring individual and structural autonomy. The core idea is that allowing communities to lead their local health strategy and regain control over their own lives is the absolute most effective way to address the stress of a sick world. Now, historically, the countercultural movements of the 1960s often get brushed off as naive escapism. But the source material points out their core ethos was actually rooted in connection, shared humanity, and peace, which was a huge missed turning point. Instead, humanity chose an opposing trajectory, defined by fragmentation, institutional decay, and systemic friction. To fix our health, we've got to reverse this trajectory. We have to shift away from reactionary polarization and reinstitute genuine autonomy and social harmony.
Section 3. The Freetown Christiania experiment.
To see how this health strategy actually works out in the real world, let's look at decades of complex history mapped out on an 85-acre abandoned military base in Copenhagen, Denmark. In September 1971, a group of activists and squatters tore down the fences and proclaimed the establishment of Freetown Christiania, an autonomous community operating entirely outside standard municipal laws. Surprisingly, rather than evicting them, the Danish government declared it an official social experiment in 1972. It was a utopian vision to build a society from scratch where individual freedom harmonized perfectly with collective responsibility.
They pulled this off through what they called radical direct democracy. The community was explicitly structured around strict consensus rules. Major decisions were handled through open common meetings. They established their own code of conduct, which included outright bans on weapons, violence, hard drugs, private land ownership, and even motor vehicles. What this proves is that genuine autonomy isn't just about doing whatever you want whenever you want. It requires intense, highly organized collective responsibility.
Section 4. Surviving the real world.
Because, no utopia exists in a vacuum. What happens when these ideals collide with real-world pressures? This brings up a fascinating paradox and a critical narrative question that tested the absolute limits of Christiania's self-governance. When you operate outside the standard laws of the state, how exactly do you protect your community from malicious outside forces, like organized crime?
This is known as the drug market paradox. From its very early days, Christiania was internationally famous for Pusher Street, an open market for hashish and cannabis. Early community members viewed this soft drug tolerance as a pillar of personal freedom. They also figured it would keep users away from far more destructive substances. However, this centralized, totally unregulated trade eventually acted like a magnet, bringing highly dangerous external organized crime syndicates right into the heart of their peaceful experiment.
But the community's response proved their incredible resilience. During the late 1970s, a severe heroin crisis hit the community, with deadly overdoses. Now, instead of calling in the state police, which would obviously compromise their autonomy, the residents autonomously self-policed. They organized what became famously known as the junk blockade. They successfully and physically pushed the hard drug dealers out of their area while simultaneously organizing communal support to help the addicts recover.
And this wasn't a one-time thing. Demonstrating that real autonomy involves incredibly difficult self-regulation, the community faced a similar test decades later. Facing rising violence from those external drug gangs on Pusher Street, the residents took a massive, historic step. They literally went out and physically dug up their own street. Talk about extreme DIY urban planning. They completely destroyed the infrastructure of the market to forcefully reject the external gangs and reclaim their neighborhood's peace. It turns out, autonomy requires constant, active maintenance.
Section 5. Reclaiming Peace and Autonomy.
Let's see how this natural experiment builds a compelling case for our health today. Today, Christiania is a vibrant, self-sustaining neighborhood of roughly 900 residents in Copenhagen. Back in 2012, they even formed a foundation to collectively purchase the land, securing a permanent legal footing while preserving their alternative lifestyle. It functions as a living testament to the fact that when a community has genuine self-determination, it generates positive emotions, and those positive emotions actively build massive social, financial, and biological capital.
Ultimately, looking at the sheer resilience and success of Christiania proves the underlying framework correct. Reclaiming individual and structural autonomy isn't just a lofty social ideal, it is a highly rational, completely logical medical intervention. It's the exact strategy we need to reduce chronic psychosocial stress and seriously address our massive global burden of disease.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a really powerful statement from the source material. A disrupted society is a sick society. If 95% of us are walking around carrying a health condition, we have to take a hard look at the health of our society itself. So ask yourself, how can you begin to reclaim a sense of autonomy in your own local community to safeguard your health in a divided world? Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you next time.